During my physical therapy appointment, my therapist stopped the exercise and said, "Your weight is making my job impossible. Maybe you should just accept being disabled." I was lying on my back on the padded therapy table, my left knee bent at a 90-degree angle while Kent Bridger pushed against my shin, testing my range of motion 6 weeks after ACL reconstruction surgery. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the small treatment room that smelled like antiseptic and rubber floor mats. My surgical scar was still pink and tight, pulling with each movement, and I'd been gritting my teeth through the discomfort because my orthopedic surgeon had told me that physical therapy was non-negotiable if I wanted to walk normally again. Kent had his hands on my leg when he said it, his fingers pressing into my calf muscle, his expression shifting from professional concentration to something that looked almost like disgust. "I'm sorry, what?" I tried to sit up, but the position made it awkward and my knee buckled slightly. He stepped back and crossed his arms over his chest, his polo shirt with the clinic logo stretching across his shoulders. "I said your weight is making recovery impossible. You're carrying an extra 60 pounds that your knee wasn't designed to support, especially post-surgery. Maybe instead of wasting both our time with these exercises, you should accept that you're going to have mobility issues for life." The assistant who usually worked with Kent during sessions, a young woman named Tara, was standing near the doorway organizing resistance bands. I saw her freeze, her hands going still on the elastic straps. Kent continued talking like he was discussing the weather instead of telling a patient to give up on walking properly. "I've been doing this for 12 years, and I can tell you right now that patients your size don't recover from major knee surgeries. The physics just don't work. You'd need to lose at least 50 pounds before we could make any real progress, and even then, the damage might be permanent." He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. "I have statistics here about obesity and surgical outcomes. The failure rate for ACL reconstruction in patients with a BMI over 30 is 73% higher than normal weight patients. You're looking at chronic pain, limited mobility, and probably a knee replacement by the time you're 50. He showed me the screen, which displayed some kind of chart I couldn't focus on because my hands had started shaking. I had been a competitive swimmer for 15 years before the injury, starting at age 8 and continuing through college where I'd been recruited to a Division II program on a partial scholarship. I wasn't swimming professionally anymore at 32, but I still coached youth swim teams 3 evenings a week and worked as an aquatics director at the Municipal Recreation Center. My body was strong, trained for endurance and power in the water, built with muscle that apparently Kent Bridger saw only as excess weight. The ACL tear had happened during a master's swim meet in April, a freak accident where my knee twisted wrong during a flip turn, and I felt something pop that made me scream underwater. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Raymond Cho, had performed the reconstruction using a patellar tendon graft, and he'd told me post-surgery that my recovery prognosis was excellent because of my fitness level and muscle strength. He'd specifically praised my conditioning and said athletes like me typically recovered faster than sedentary patients. He'd referred me to Bridger Physical Therapy because they specialized in sports medicine and had a good reputation for working with athletes returning to competition. I'd started sessions 2 weeks after surgery, coming in 3 times per week for exercises designed to restore range of motion, rebuild strength, and eventually return me to swimming. Kent had been professional enough during the first few sessions, focused on baseline assessments and gentle movements. But I'd noticed him making comments about my body that felt off. Little remarks about how I was carrying more weight than most swimmers, and how I didn't look like the typical athlete. I'd brushed them off as awkward attempts at motivation, or maybe just poor bedside manner. This was my 9th session, and Kent had been increasingly critical over the past 2 weeks. During session 6, he'd commented that my weight was slowing down the healing process, and suggested I consider a serious diet plan alongside therapy. During session 7, he'd spent 15 minutes talking about bariatric surgery and how some of his patients had only made progress after addressing their obesity issues. During session 8, he'd weighed me on the clinic scale without asking permission first, announcing the number out loud and then shaking his head like he'd confirmed some terrible suspicion. Each comment had felt like a small violation, but I'd told myself I was being oversensitive, that he was just concerned about my recovery in a clinical way, even if his delivery was rough. Now, lying on this table being told to accept permanent disability because of my body size, I realized I'd been making excuses for behavior that was completely unacceptable. Kent was still scrolling through his phone, pulling up more charts and statistics to prove his point about obesity and surgical failure rates. He said I should be realistic about my limitations instead of pushing through exercises that weren't going to work anyway. He said he'd seen hundreds of cases like mine and they all ended the same way, with patients giving up and accepting their new baseline of function. He said if I really cared about my health, I'd focus on weight loss instead of wasting money on physical therapy sessions that insurance was probably barely covering anyway. Tara finally moved from her spot by the door. She walked over to Kent and said quietly that maybe they should focus on the scheduled exercises for today and discuss concerns about recovery timelines separately. Kent waved her off without looking at her. He told her this was a clinical assessment based on evidence and patient outcomes, and that giving false hope to patients was unethical. He turned back to me and said that if I wanted to continue therapy, he'd require me to sign a waiver acknowledging that I understood the poor prognosis and that the clinic wouldn't be responsible when the surgery ultimately failed. I sat up on the table, ignoring the sharp pull in my knee. I asked him if he was serious, if he was actually refusing to continue physical therapy for a post-surgical patient because of my weight. He said he wasn't refusing anything. He was just being honest about the reality of the situation, something other therapists were too politically correct to say out loud. He said patients deserved to know the truth even when it was uncomfortable, and the truth was that my body type made successful recovery statistically unlikely. I asked him what my body type had to do with following the post-surgical protocol that my surgeon had prescribed. He actually laughed, and said that surgeons operated in ideal conditions and didn't have to deal with the messy reality of rehabilitation in non-ideal bodies. He said Dr. Cho probably hadn't factored in my weight when he'd given me that excellent prognosis, and that he was the one who'd have to manage my disappointment when the surgery didn't deliver the results I was expecting. I got down from the table, carefully putting weight on my surgical leg, feeling the familiar ache and tightness that I'd been told was normal for 6 weeks post-op. I told Kent I was done with the session and needed to speak to whoever managed the clinic. He asked if I was really going to complain just because he'd given me medical facts I didn't want to hear. I didn't answer, just grabbed my bag from the chair and started walking toward the door. He called after me that running away from the truth wasn't going to make my knee heal any faster, and that I'd be back once I realized no other therapist was going to tell me anything different. Tara caught up with me in the hallway and said she was sorry about what happened, that Kent's approach was inappropriate and she'd document everything she'd witnessed. I thanked her and asked where I could find the clinic director. She pointed me toward an office at the end of the hall and said the director's name was Michelle Strauss, that she'd been managing the clinic for 8 years and took patient concerns seriously. I walked to that office on my healing knee, each step sending signals of discomfort up my leg, and knocked on the door marked Director. Michelle Strauss was in her mid-50s with gray hair cut short and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked up from her computer when I knocked and smiled in that professional way that healthcare administrators have mastered. She asked how she could help me, and I told her I needed to file a complaint about Kent Bridger's conduct during my therapy session. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted, like I'd said something she'd heard before but hoped not to hear again. She asked me to sit down and explain what happened. I went through the entire session, repeating Kent's comments about my weight making recovery impossible, his suggestion that I should accept being disabled, the statistics he'd shown me about obesity and surgical failure, the waiver he wanted me to sign. Michelle took notes on a yellow legal pad, her pen moving steadily across the page. When I finished, she asked if Tara had been present for these comments. I said yes, that Tara had witnessed everything and had told me she would document it. Michelle wrote something down and then looked at me over her reading glasses. She said she took these concerns very seriously and would investigate immediately, that patient dignity and appropriate professional conduct were foundational to their clinic's mission. She asked me to give her 24 hours to speak with Kent and review the situation, and then we could schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss next steps. I asked what would happen to my physical therapy in the meantime, whether I'd be assigned to a different therapist or if my treatment would be interrupted. She said she'd make sure I was reassigned immediately to another therapist who could continue my post-surgical protocol without any gaps in care. She'd have someone call me by the end of the day to schedule my next appointment with a different provider. I left the clinic feeling shaky and disoriented, like the ground rules of reality had shifted without warning. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before I could bring myself to drive home. My phone buzzed with a text from my wife, Shauna, asking how therapy went. I typed out, "We need to talk when I get home," and then deleted it, replacing it with, "Fine, heading back now," because I wasn't ready to put what happened into words yet. The drive took 15 minutes through afternoon traffic, and I spent the whole time replaying Kent's comments in my head, analyzing whether I'd misunderstood or overreacted. But no matter how many times I reviewed the conversation, his words remained clear and cruel. My weight was making recovery impossible. I should accept being disabled. My body type made successful rehabilitation statistically unlikely. These weren't clinical observations delivered with professional detachment. These were judgments about my worth as a patient and my right to expect recovery from a medically necessary surgery. When I got home, Shauna was in the kitchen making dinner, and she took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I told her everything, and she stopped chopping vegetables to listen, her expression moving from confusion to anger as I described what Kent had said. When I finished, she put down the knife and said we needed to report this to my surgeon and probably to whatever licensing board governed physical therapists. She said what Kent did was medical discrimination at minimum and possibly malpractice for refusing to provide prescribed care. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the other patients Kent had mentioned, the hundreds of cases like mine, who'd all supposedly failed and given up. I wondered how many people he'd convinced to accept disability, how many patients had believed his statistics and stopped fighting for recovery. I thought about the waiver he'd wanted me to sign, acknowledging poor prognosis and releasing the clinic from responsibility for surgical failure. That waiver wasn't standard post-surgical documentation. That was Kent covering himself, creating legal protection for outcomes he was actively causing by refusing to provide adequate care. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got, and the anger was better than the shame and self-doubt that had been creeping in since I'd left the clinic. Shauna spent an hour researching physical therapy licensing requirements and complaint procedures while I sat on the couch with ice on my knee. She found the State Physical Therapy Board website and pulled up the complaint form. It asked for detailed descriptions of the incident, dates and times, names of witnesses, and supporting documentation. She said we should file a complaint with the board and also send a detailed letter to Dr. Cho explaining why I'd stopped going to the therapy clinic he'd recommended. She said I should document everything while it was fresh in my memory, including exact quotes as close as I could remember them. I spent the next 2 hours writing out a timeline of every session with Kent, every inappropriate comment, every weight-related criticism. I noted the dates of sessions 6, 7, and 8 when he'd escalated from awkward comments to explicit statements about my weight preventing recovery. I documented today's session in detail, including his exact words about accepting disability, the statistics he'd shown me, and the waiver he'd demanded I sign. I included Tara's presence as a witness and Michelle Strauss's response when I'd filed the complaint with clinic management. When I finished, I had 4 single-spaced pages of documentation that read like a systematic pattern of weight-based discrimination disguised as clinical assessment. Shauna read through it and said it was clear and damning, that no reasonable person could read this and think Kent's behavior was appropriate. She said we should also request my complete medical records from the clinic, including Kent's session notes, because those notes might reveal whether he'd been documenting his concerns about my weight as legitimate medical observations or whether they showed bias. Under federal law, I had a right to access my complete medical records within 30 days of requesting them. The next morning, I called Dr. Cho's office and asked to speak with him about a concern regarding my physical therapy. His nurse said he was in surgery all day but could return my call that evening. I explained that it was urgent, that I'd experienced discriminatory treatment at the physical therapy clinic he'd referred me to, and needed to discuss alternative options for continuing my post-surgical rehabilitation. She said she'd make sure he got the message as soon as he was out of surgery. I also called Bridger Physical Therapy and asked to speak with Michelle Strauss. The receptionist put me through, and Michelle answered, sounding slightly harried. She said she'd been planning to call me later that day, that she'd completed her preliminary investigation into my complaint. She said she'd spoken with Kent and reviewed Tara's documentation of the session, and she was recommending that Kent complete additional training on patient communication and cultural sensitivity. She said she'd assigned me to work with a different therapist named David Lang, who had extensive experience with post-surgical knee rehabilitation and excellent patient reviews. She apologized for my negative experience and assured me the clinic was committed to providing appropriate care to all patients regardless of body size or type. I asked what specific actions were being taken regarding Kent's conduct, whether there would be any formal discipline beyond training. Michelle paused and said that personnel matters were confidential, but that the clinic took all complaints seriously and addressed them according to their internal policies. She said Kent would not be treating me or any other patients I referred, and that she'd personally oversee my care going forward to ensure I was satisfied with the service. I thanked her for the follow-up, but told her I'd decided to continue my physical therapy at a different clinic, that I didn't feel comfortable returning to a facility where a therapist had told me to accept permanent disability based on my weight. Michelle sounded genuinely disappointed and said she understood my decision but hoped I'd reconsider given the clinic's reputation and David Lang's qualifications. I told her I appreciated her handling the complaint, but that my trust in the clinic had been broken. I hung up and immediately drafted a formal records request to the clinic, asking for complete copies of all therapy session notes, assessments, communications, and billing records related to my treatment. I sent it via certified mail so I'd have proof of delivery. Dr. Cho called me that evening at 6:30, right after his last surgery. He said he'd gotten my message and wanted to understand what had happened at the physical therapy clinic. I gave him the full account, including Kent's exact statements and the statistics he'd shown me about obesity and surgical failure rates. Dr. Cho was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then he said that Kent's assessment was not only inappropriate but medically inaccurate. He said my surgical outcome had been excellent, the graft had integrated well, and there was no clinical reason I shouldn't make a full recovery with appropriate rehabilitation. He said my weight had never been a factor in his surgical planning or prognosis, that I was a conditioned athlete with good muscle mass, and that those factors were far more relevant to recovery than BMI. Dr. Cho said he'd refer me to a different physical therapy clinic that specialized in working with athletes and had a strong track record of post-surgical knee rehabilitation. He said he'd personally call the director there and explain my case to ensure continuity of care. He also said he was going to contact Bridger Physical Therapy directly to express his concerns about their handling of my case, that as a referring physician he had a responsibility to ensure his patients received appropriate care. He asked if I'd be willing to share the documentation I'd written about Kent's conduct, and I said I'd email it to him as soon as we hung up. He thanked me for bringing this to his attention and said he was sorry I'd experienced discrimination when you should have been focusing on recovery. That conversation with Dr. Cho helped more than I expected, having a medical professional validate that Kent's assessment was wrong and that my body wasn't the problem. I sent him the documentation that night and received a response the next morning thanking me and confirming he'd made the referral to the new physical therapy clinic. He said the director there, a woman named Dr. Aisha Patel, who had a PhD in exercise physiology and specialized in athletic rehabilitation, was expecting my call. I called Dr. Patel's clinic, North Shore Sports Rehabilitation, and scheduled an initial evaluation for the following week. The receptionist was warm and professional, asking about my injury, surgery date, and current symptoms without making a single comment about my appearance or weight. That should have been completely normal, But after Kent's treatment, the absence of judgment felt like a relief. I also filed the formal complaint with the State Physical Therapy Board using the online portal Shauna had found. The form asked me to describe the specific conduct I was complaining about and explain how it violated professional standards. I attached the 4-page documentation I'd written, including the timeline of all sessions and exact quotes from Kent's comments. The form asked if I wanted my complaint to remain confidential, or if I consented to my information being shared if the board decided to pursue disciplinary action. I selected that I consented to disclosure, because I wanted Kent held accountable even if it meant my name became part of the official record. The confirmation page said the board would review my complaint within 30 days and contact me if they needed additional information or documentation. My first appointment with Dr. Aisha Patel happened on a Monday morning at North Shore Sports Rehabilitation. The facility was brighter and more modern than Bridger's clinic, with large windows overlooking a park and equipment that looked newer and better maintained. Dr. Patel met me in the evaluation room, a woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and a calm, confident manner that immediately put me at ease. She asked me to walk her through my injury and surgery, my current symptoms, and what I'd been doing for therapy so far. I gave her the clinical details first, explaining the ACL tear, the patellar tendon graft reconstruction, Dr. Cho's surgical notes. Then I told her about my experience at Bridger Physical Therapy and why I'd switched clinics. I didn't go into all the details, just said I'd experienced inappropriate comments about my weight from my previous therapist and hadn't felt comfortable continuing there. Dr. Patel's expression didn't change, but she made a note on her intake form and said that weight-based discrimination in healthcare settings was unfortunately common and completely unacceptable. She said her clinic's philosophy was that everybody was capable of healing and strengthening when given appropriate, evidence-based treatment. Dr. Patel conducted a thorough physical exam, testing my range of motion, strength, stability, and proprioception. She measured everything precisely with a goniometer and documented each finding. When she finished, she said my surgical site was healing well, my range of motion was appropriate for 6 weeks post-op, and my muscle engagement was actually better than average for this stage of recovery. She said my swimming background had given me excellent body awareness and muscle control that would help with rehabilitation. She designed a treatment plan that included manual therapy, targeted strengthening exercises, balance training, and eventually sport-specific movements to prepare me for returning to swimming. She said most patients at my stage came in 3 times per week for about 8 weeks, then transitioned to a home program with periodic check-ins. She asked if I had any questions or concerns about the plan, and I asked her directly about my weight and whether it would affect my recovery timeline. She looked at me with what seemed like genuine confusion and said that body weight was just one of many factors that influenced recovery, and in my case, my strength and conditioning were far more relevant than my size. She said she'd worked with athletes of all body types, and the common factor in successful recovery was consistent effort and proper technique, not a specific number on a scale. That first session with Dr. Patel felt like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight. She treated me like an athlete recovering from injury, not like a problem patient whose body made rehabilitation impossible. Over the next 3 weeks, I went to North Shore 3 times per week and made steady progress. My range of motion improved, my strength increased, my gait pattern normalized. Dr. Patel adjusted the exercises each session based on my response, pushing me when I could handle more challenge and modifying when I needed recovery time. She never once mentioned my weight except to note that my muscle mass was an advantage in building strength quickly. By week 9 post-surgery, I was walking without a limp and starting to do basic pool exercises in the therapy pool at North Shore. Dr. Patel said my progress was excellent and ahead of the typical timeline, that I might be cleared to return to regular swimming by month 4 instead of month 6. None of this matched Kent Bridger's prediction that I should accept permanent disability. Meanwhile, I received my medical records from Bridger Physical Therapy exactly 29 days after my certified mail request. The package included session notes from all 9 appointments with Kent, intake paperwork, and billing records. I sat at my kitchen table and read through Kent's documentation while Shauna made coffee and periodically asked if I was okay. The session notes were revealing in ways I hadn't expected. For sessions 1 through 5, Kent had documented my progress in standard clinical language. Patient tolerated exercises well, minimal swelling, ROM improving as expected. But starting with session 6, his notes began including comments about my weight and its supposed impact on recovery. Session 6 notes said, patient's excess body weight creating additional stress on surgical site may impact healing timeline. Discussed need for weight management alongside PT. Session 7 notes said, patient remains overweight, limiting exercise options. Recommended bariatric consultation to address obesity contributing to poor mobility. Session 8 notes said, patient weighed at 184 pounds, BMI 31, obese category. Prognosis guarded due to weight factors. Patient resistant to weight loss discussion. Session 9 notes, from the day he told me to accept disability said, patient non-compliant with weight management recommendations, unable to perform prescribed exercises due to obesity. Recommended patient accept limitations and discontinue aggressive rehabilitation goals. Patient became confrontational and left session early. Reading those notes made my hands shake with anger. Kent had documented a completely false narrative where I was non-compliant and confrontational, where my weight was preventing me from doing exercises, where he'd made reasonable medical recommendations that I'd rejected. There was no mention of him telling me to accept being disabled. No mention of showing me statistics about surgical failure rates. No mention of demanding I sign a waiver acknowledging poor prognosis. His notes portrayed him as a concerned clinician trying to help a difficult patient, when the reality was he'd engaged in systematic weight-based harassment disguised as medical advice. I called Shauna over to read the notes, and she swore under her breath as she flipped through the pages. She said these notes were evidence of discrimination, that he'd created a paper trail to justify refusing to provide care based on my weight. She said we needed to send these records to the physical therapy board with my complaint, because they showed Kent's bias clearly documented in clinical language. I scanned all the session notes and sent them to the State Physical Therapy Board through their online portal, attaching them to my existing complaint. I included a cover letter explaining that the notes contradicted my account of what happened and demonstrated Kent's weight-based bias. I also sent copies to Dr. Cho and Michelle Strauss at Bridger Physical Therapy. Dr. Cho called me 2 days later and said the notes were concerning from a medical standpoint, that Kent's clinical assessments didn't match the objective progress I'd been making at North Shore. He said he'd submitted a formal complaint to Bridger's ownership group and copied the state medical board on the correspondence. He said, as a referring physician, he had an obligation to advocate for his patients and ensure the facilities he recommended maintained appropriate standards of care. Michelle Strauss called me that same afternoon and left a voicemail saying she'd received the session notes and wanted to discuss them with me, that some of Kent's documentation raised concerns she wanted to address. I didn't call her back immediately because I wasn't sure what more there was to discuss, but 2 days later she called again and I answered. Michelle said she'd conducted a more thorough review of Kent's patient files and found a disturbing pattern. She said at least 6 other patients over the past 2 years had complained about Kent making inappropriate comments about their weight or appearance during therapy sessions. She said these complaints had been handled informally through verbal counseling and patient reassignments, but she now realized that approach had been inadequate. She said Kent's session notes for multiple patients showed similar patterns of documenting weight-based concerns that didn't align with clinical presentations or surgical outcomes. She said the clinic's ownership group had made the decision to terminate Kent's employment effective immediately and would be reviewing all patient complaints to determine if additional actions were needed. She said she was personally sorry for not recognizing the pattern earlier and taking stronger action when the first complaints came in. She asked if I'd be willing to speak with the clinic's attorney about my experience, that they were preparing documentation for their malpractice insurance carrier and wanted to ensure they had complete information about Kent's conduct. I said I'd consider it but wanted to consult with an attorney myself first before providing any formal statements to the clinic's legal team. Shauna and I spent that evening researching medical malpractice attorneys who handled discrimination cases. We found a firm called Davidson & Associates that specialized in healthcare civil rights violations and had won several high-profile cases against medical providers who'd discriminated against patients based on weight, race, or disability status. I called their office the next morning and spoke with a paralegal who took basic information about my case. She said one of their senior attorneys, Miriam Cho, would review my complaint and session notes and call me within 48 hours if the firm was interested in taking the case. Miriam Cho called me the following afternoon. She had 18 years of experience in medical malpractice law and had handled dozens of cases involving weight-based discrimination in healthcare settings. She said my case had strong merit based on the session notes alone, which clearly documented Kent's bias and refusal to provide prescribed treatment. She said the fact that Kent had been terminated and that multiple other patients had complained created a pattern that would be valuable in litigation. She asked about my damages, what harm I'd suffered as a result of Kent's conduct. I explained that I'd lost 3 weeks of critical post-surgical rehabilitation time, had experienced emotional distress and shame that affected my mental health, and had incurred additional costs transferring to a new clinic. Miriam said those were all compensable damages, and that we might also pursue punitive damages against Bridger Physical Therapy for enabling Kent's conduct despite receiving multiple complaints. She said the clinic's informal response to previous complaints rather than taking formal disciplinary action suggested they'd prioritized avoiding liability over protecting patients. She offered to take my case on contingency, meaning I wouldn't pay any attorney fees unless we won a settlement or judgment. She said her fee would be 33% of any recovery, which was standard for medical malpractice cases. She'd need me to sign a representation agreement and provide her with all documentation I'd collected, including the session notes, my written timeline, communications with Dr. Cho and Michelle Strauss, and records from my treatment at North Shore showing my actual progress. I agreed and went to her office the next day to sign the paperwork. Miriam filed a civil complaint against Kent Bridger and Bridger Physical Therapy 3 weeks later. The complaint alleged medical malpractice, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of state anti-discrimination laws prohibiting discrimination in places of public accommodation based on weight. It detailed Kent's comments during sessions 6 through 9, quoted from his session notes, and described the clinic's inadequate response to multiple patient complaints. It requested compensatory damages for my medical expenses, emotional distress, and lost wages from missing work during the extended rehabilitation period, plus punitive damages for the clinic's willful disregard of patient safety. Miriam said the clinic's insurance carrier would likely want to settle to avoid the publicity of a trial, especially given the existence of multiple complainants. She said we should expect a settlement offer within 60 to 90 days, though it might take longer if they decided to fight. In the meantime, she'd begin discovery, requesting all patient complaint records from the clinic and Kent's complete employment file. The State Physical Therapy Board responded to my complaint about 6 weeks after I'd filed it. The letter said they'd reviewed my submission and determined that probable cause existed to believe Kent Bridger had violated professional standards of practice. They were opening a formal investigation and had notified Kent of the complaint. He had 30 days to file a response, and then the board would determine whether to proceed with disciplinary action up to and including license suspension or revocation. The letter said the investigation would likely take 4 to 6 months, and that I might be asked to provide additional information or testimony if the case proceeded to a formal hearing. I felt relieved that the board was taking it seriously, that this wasn't just going to disappear into bureaucratic processes. Shauna and I celebrated with takeout that night, sitting on our couch talking about how far things had come from that terrible session 3 months earlier. I was walking without pain, swimming gentle laps in the pool at North Shore, and seeing real progress toward full recovery. Kent's prediction that I should accept disability had been completely wrong, and I had the clinical documentation from Dr. Patel to prove it. My progress at North Shore continued steadily through month 3 and into month 4 post-surgery. Dr. Patel gradually increased the intensity and complexity of my exercises, adding resistance training, plyometric movements, and sport-specific drills. She video recorded my swimming stroke and analyzed my technique for any compensatory patterns that might stress my healing knee. She consulted with Dr. Cho about my progress and coordinated my care to ensure everything aligned with his surgical timeline. By month 4, I was swimming full workouts at about 70% intensity, and my knee felt stable and strong. Dr. Patel said I was ahead of schedule and could probably return to coaching in another month if I continued progressing. None of this would have been possible if I'd believed Kent's assessment that my body made recovery impossible. I'd have given up, accepted disability, and lost something fundamental about my identity as an athlete and coach. That realization made me even more determined to pursue the legal case and the licensing complaint, because Kent was still out there potentially telling other patients the same lies. The settlement offer from Bridger Physical Therapy's insurance carrier came exactly 78 days after Miriam filed the civil complaint. They offered $42,000 to settle all claims without admission of wrongdoing, with a confidentiality agreement preventing me from discussing the case publicly. Miriam called me to discuss the offer and her recommendation. She said the amount was reasonable for compensatory damages but didn't include meaningful punitive damages or accountability beyond money. She said the confidentiality agreement was standard but would prevent me from warning other patients about Kent or discussing the clinic's pattern of mishandling complaints. She asked whether I wanted to counter-offer for more money or reject the confidentiality clause. I told her the confidentiality agreement was a deal-breaker, that accepting money to stay quiet would make me complicit in protecting Kent and the clinic from consequences. Miriam said she'd anticipated that response and was prepared to counter-offer for higher damages without the confidentiality clause, or alternatively to reject the settlement and proceed to trial. We decided to counter at $90,000 with no confidentiality agreement, and explicit terms requiring the clinic to implement new policies for handling patient complaints and training all staff on weight-based discrimination. Miriam said demanding policy changes as part of settlement was unusual, but could be positioned as preventing future harm, rather than punishing past conduct. The insurance carrier responded 2 weeks later rejecting our counteroffer and stating that removing the confidentiality clause made settlement unacceptable to their client. They said if we weren't willing to agree to confidentiality, they'd defend the case at trial. Miriam said this meant we were going to litigation, which would take at least a year and involve significant time commitment from me for depositions and trial preparation. She said we had a strong case, but trials were always uncertain, that we might win everything or lose everything depending on how the jury perceived the evidence. I told her I was prepared to go to trial, that this had stopped being just about my experience and become about preventing Kent from harming other patients. The discovery phase of litigation began in earnest that fall. Miriam subpoenaed all patient complaint records from Bridger Physical Therapy going back 5 years. The clinic fought the subpoena, claiming patient privacy concerns, but the judge ordered them to produce the records with identifying information redacted. When the documents arrived, they revealed a stunning pattern. Kent had been the subject of 18 separate patient complaints over 5 years, all involving inappropriate comments about weight, body size, or appearance. The complaints ranged from, made me feel uncomfortable about my body, to, told me I was too fat to benefit from therapy, to, said I should have weight loss surgery before wasting time on rehabilitation. The clinic had responded to every single complaint with internal counseling sessions and patient reassignments, but had never formally disciplined Kent or reported the pattern to the state licensing board. Miriam said these records were devastating to the clinic's defense, that they showed clear knowledge of Kent's misconduct and deliberate failure to protect patients. Miriam also subpoenaed Kent's personnel file, which included his hiring documents, performance reviews, and internal disciplinary records. The performance reviews were especially interesting because they showed clinic management praising Kent's honest communication with patients and willingness to have difficult conversations about lifestyle factors affecting recovery. His supervisor had written in one review that Kent's direct approach to patient accountability was valuable even though some patients found it uncomfortable. Reading between the lines, it was clear the clinic had known about Kent's behavior, had framed it as a positive attribute, and had deliberately ignored patient complaints because they saw his conduct as medically justified tough love. Miriam said this evidence of institutional knowledge and approval would support punitive damages and potentially increase the settlement value dramatically if the clinic wanted to avoid trial. The depositions began that winter. Miriam deposed Kent first, and I sat in the conference room watching him answer questions under oath. He was less confident than he'd been in the therapy clinic, more careful with his words, but the fundamental attitude remained. He testified that he'd made clinical assessments based on medical evidence about obesity and surgical outcomes. He said he'd tried to help patients understand realistic expectations rather than giving them false hope about recovery. He said I'd been resistant to discussions about weight management and had left the session when he tried to address those concerns. When Miriam played him the recordings Tara had made during our sessions, his face went pale. Tara had apparently documented multiple sessions on her phone because she'd been concerned about Kent's conduct and wanted evidence if patients complained. The recordings captured Kent telling me to accept disability, showing me statistics, and demanding I sign a waiver. They also captured him making similar comments to 2 other patients during the same week, telling one woman that her obesity was sabotaging her recovery, and another that she needed to prioritize weight loss over physical therapy. The recordings were a game changer. Kent's attorney tried to argue they were illegally obtained and inadmissible, but the judge ruled that Tara had been acting within her role as a clinical assistant documenting patient care, and that the recordings were admissible as evidence. Miriam deposed Michelle Strauss next, and Michelle testified that she'd been aware of patient complaints about Kent, but had believed verbal counseling was appropriate based on his explanations that patients were misinterpreting clinical advice. She said in hindsight she should have taken stronger action sooner, but at the time she'd trusted Kent's clinical judgment and hadn't recognized the pattern of discriminatory conduct. She said the clinic had implemented new policies after my complaint, including mandatory reporting of patient complaints to ownership, formal investigation protocols, and training on anti-discrimination practices. Miriam asked why those policies hadn't existed before, and Michelle had no good answer. The settlement negotiations resumed that spring. The clinic's insurance carrier made a new offer of $135,000 with terms requiring the clinic to maintain the new complaint policies for at least 5 years and to provide annual training on weight-based discrimination to all clinical staff. They dropped the confidentiality requirement, apparently realizing the recordings made trial too risky. Miriam recommended I accept the offer, saying it represented fair compensation for my damages plus meaningful institutional change that would protect future patients. I agreed, and we signed the settlement agreement in May, almost exactly 1 year after the injury that had started everything. The clinic issued a public statement saying they'd settled a patient discrimination case and implemented new policies to ensure all patients received respectful, evidence-based care regardless of body size. They didn't name me or Kent, but the local newspaper picked up the story and did some investigative reporting that connected the dots. The newspaper article ran 3 weeks after the settlement. The reporter, a woman named Felicia Rains who specialized in healthcare coverage, had obtained the State Physical Therapy Board's investigation records through a public records request. Those records showed that 12 patients had filed complaints about Kent Bridger over 5 years, all involving weight-based discrimination. The board had revoked Kent's license 6 months earlier after a formal hearing where multiple patients testified about his conduct. Kent had not appealed the revocation and was permanently barred from practicing physical therapy in the state. Felicia interviewed several of the complainants, including me, and published a detailed investigation titled Pattern of Bias: How One Physical Therapist's Weight Discrimination Went Unchecked for Years. The article described the clinic's failure to act on repeated complaints, quoted from Kent's discriminatory session notes, and included testimony from the licensing board hearing. It also included a statement from Dr. Cho about the importance of appropriate post-surgical rehabilitation and the harm caused when bias interferes with patient care. The article generated significant community response. Other patients who'd experienced similar treatment from Kent or other healthcare providers reached out to share their stories. A local patient advocacy group organized a forum on weight-based discrimination in healthcare and invited me to speak about my experience. I hesitated at first because talking publicly about the case meant exposing myself to judgment and criticism. But Shauna encouraged me to do it, saying my voice could help other people recognize discrimination and advocate for themselves. I agreed to speak, and the forum drew over 200 people to a community center auditorium. I told my story from start to finish, including Kent's exact words, and my decision to fight back through complaints, legal action, and public exposure. I talked about the shame I'd felt initially, wondering if maybe Kent was right and my body was the problem. I talked about Dr. Patel's completely different approach and how her evidence-based, respectful care had led to full recovery. I talked about the importance of documenting discrimination, finding allies, and refusing to accept maltreatment just because it came from someone with medical credentials. The response to my presentation was overwhelming. Multiple people approached me afterward to share their own experiences of weight-based medical discrimination. Some had delayed necessary care because previous providers had made them feel ashamed. Others had received substandard treatment because providers focused on their weight rather than their actual medical concerns. Several people asked how to file complaints or find attorneys, and I connected them with resources. The patient advocacy group asked if I'd be willing to serve on their board to help develop educational materials about patient rights and discrimination in healthcare settings. I agreed, and over the next year, I worked with them to create guides for filing complaints, choosing appropriate providers, and advocating for respectful care. We distributed the materials through community health centers, support groups, and online platforms. The work felt meaningful in a way I hadn't expected, taking my personal experience of harm and transforming it into systemic advocacy. Meanwhile, I'd returned to coaching youth swim teams and working at the recreation center. My knee was fully healed, strong and stable, with no limitations on activity. I was swimming competitive times again and had even placed in my age group at a regional masters meet. Dr. Cho discharged me from his care at month 6 post-surgery, with a note in my file saying I'd achieved excellent surgical outcome with full return to pre-injury function. Dr. Patel transitioned me to a maintenance program of home exercises and periodic check-ins. Every time I swam or coached or walked without pain, I thought about Kent's prediction that I should accept being disabled. He'd been completely wrong, and I had the clinical documentation and functional outcomes to prove it. But I also knew that if I'd believed him, if I hadn't had the resources and support to fight back, I might have internalized his discrimination as medical truth. That possibility haunted me and motivated me to keep doing advocacy work. 2 years after the initial incident, I received a letter from the State Physical Therapy Board. They'd completed a systematic review of patient complaints at physical therapy clinics statewide and found that weight-based discrimination was the second most common complaint category after billing disputes. They were implementing new regulations requiring all licensed physical therapists to complete continuing education on anti-discrimination practices and patient-centered care. The regulations also required clinics to establish formal complaint procedures and report patterns of patient concerns to the board. The letter thanked me for my complaint and testimony, saying my case had helped identify a significant gap in regulatory oversight. I felt proud reading that letter, knowing that the harm I'd experienced had led to changes that would protect other patients. The system wasn't perfect, and weight-based discrimination in healthcare remained common, but at least there were new mechanisms for accountability. I ran into Tara, Kent's former assistant, at a coffee shop about 18 months after the settlement. She approached my table and asked if she could talk to me for a minute. She said she'd left Bridger Physical Therapy shortly after Kent was fired and was now working at a different clinic with better ethical standards. She said making those recordings of Kent's sessions had been risky but necessary, that she'd watched him harm too many patients and couldn't stay silent anymore. She said my willingness to fight back had given her courage to document the abuse and eventually testify at the licensing board hearing. She thanked me for not giving up when the clinic tried to handle everything quietly, for pushing until there were real consequences. I thanked her for being a witness and ally when I'd needed one most. We talked for a while about our current work and lives, and she mentioned she was considering going back to school to become a physical therapist herself, one who would prioritize patient dignity and evidence-based care. I told her the profession needed people like her. 3 years after the incident, I'm swimming faster than I did before the injury, coaching 3 youth teams, and serving on the board of the patient advocacy organization. My knee is completely pain-free with full range of motion and strength. Shauna and I talk sometimes about how different things would have been if I'd believed Kent's assessment, if I'd accepted his prediction of permanent disability as medical truth. I probably would have given up swimming, would have struggled with shame and self-blame, would have lost a fundamental part of my identity. Instead, I fought back, and that choice led not just to my own recovery, but to systemic changes that protected other patients. Kent Bridger lost his license permanently and can never practice physical therapy again. Bridger Physical Therapy implemented new policies and continues operating under closer regulatory scrutiny. 12 other patients who'd complained about Kent got validation that their experiences were real and unacceptable. The State Physical Therapy Board created new regulations addressing discrimination. Those outcomes mattered, but the personal victory mattered too, proving that my body was capable of healing when given appropriate, respectful care. The Physical Therapy Board recently asked me to serve on a patient advisory committee that reviews complaint procedures and recommends policy changes. I accepted, seeing it as another way to ensure patients who experience discrimination had avenues for accountability. The work isn't glamorous, mostly reading complaint files and attending quarterly meetings, but it's important. Every complaint I review represents a person who trusted a healthcare provider and experienced harm instead of healing. Some complaints are addressed appropriately, others get buried in bureaucracy, and my job is to push for better outcomes. I think about Kent's 18 complaints that the clinic mishandled and wonder how many patients I can help by improving the systems meant to protect them. It's not enough to win your individual case. You have to change the structures that allowed the harm to happen in the first place. If you made it this far, hit like. You've earned it.